Hey, I'm Matt Manning. Thanks so much for joining me for this final session, session 6 of our 40 Days of Compassion study. Go ahead and grab your study guide. I hope you've enjoyed working through the first 5 sessions with me, and then now we'll come to the 6th session as we wrap it up. A couple of things I want to make note of before we wrap up our last session. As you come to this last session, if you enjoyed this, would love for you to be able to give us some feedback. Let us know. You can go to Amazon.com and go ahead and look up the title for both this book, 40 Days of Compassion, and then as well the supplemental devotional called Created for Compassion. And you can go ahead and leave a rating and review. That helps us in a great way to have feedback about the material, and then as well, it'll be able to put these resources before the eyes of other people. And so the more ratings and reviews, that allows other people to find out about this content and to be able to find out how best it can help in their walk with God and their growth spiritually. Let's go ahead and take a look at session 6 as we talk about the door of compassion, answering my compassion calling. As you turn there, we'll look and see that this final session, our theme verse for this, is taken from John chapter 17, where Jesus, it's just before he's about to go to the cross, and he prays this prayer. We talk about the Lord's Prayer, Our Father which art in heaven, and really that prayer Jesus gives as an example for the disciples, so it would be better known as the disciples' prayer. But really the Lord's Prayer, Jesus' prayer, is found in John chapter 17. If you look there in your notes on page 89, we see it says, just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. You can just jot down there, and there's lots of white space there for you. Just jot down my mission. My mission. Jesus is sending you and me on mission. He talks about the fact that God gave him the disciples there at that time in that moment, but then Jesus also prays for those who have yet to believe, who have yet to follow, to become disciples of his. He's praying for you and me, and he's praying for us as we go on mission for Jesus. And what is our mission? Well, it's a mission of compassion, to share Jesus, the hope of who he is, and the gospel with people. It's to selflessly lead. It's to help the poor, care for the sick, and then reach and teach the next generation the truth about God and the truth about who Jesus Christ is, so they can teach the next generation and the following generation, as we learned last session in session number 5. As you turn your page there, we look at this, that our calling is to live out our mission, the mission that God has given to us. And when we talk about mission, sometimes we find is something that we can kind of have a hard time wrapping our minds around. If you grew up in church at all, maybe you heard of people who are missionaries. That is, individuals who went to another country to start a church, to share the gospel, to start some kind of organization to reach people there. Thinking of a mission, I also think about people in the military who go on a mission to rescue someone or to infiltrate someplace and to do some kind of secret, clandestine kind of thing under the cover of darkness. Or I think of Tom Cruise with Mission Impossible. What we find here, Jesus gives this mission, and it's not a mission that's impossible, but it's a mission that is possible with him. What we find here, when it comes to your mission and your life calling, if you look on page 93 with me for a minute, look there at the middle of the page, and there are 5 questions we want to look at before we jump into our session. 5 questions to ask yourself in light of all that we've talked about through these past 5 weeks, now coming to the 6th week. Number 1 there is, what can I do that can help people come to Jesus? And that answers that first session, number 1, about sharing Jesus. What can I do? How can I share my story to help people come to Jesus? Number 2, what can I do that tackles one of the 5 challenges facing our world today? So the 5 challenges: spiritual darkness. We talked about selfish leadership. We talked about poverty. We talked about sickness, and we talked about illiteracy, or the next generation to be discipled, to be mentored, and to have their lives poured into. The third question is this: how can I use my spiritual gift, my passions, my personality, my abilities, and my experiences to serve people? How can I show compassion based on bringing all those together? Based on bringing together my spiritual gifts, my passions, my abilities, my personality, my experiences. And then we find number 4, of all the sessions, sharing Jesus, selfless leadership, helping the poor, caring for the sick, teaching the next generation. What most lights me up, what makes me feel passionate, what makes and motivates me to action, whatever it might be, that most likely will be your compassion calling, if you will. And then number 5, what have I tried in the past? What am I doing right now? Or what can I do in the future that responds to God's call in my life? What have you tried in the past that's worked well? What have you tried in the past that, well, it didn't really work too well and it was kind of a mismatch for you? Maybe you tried to work with kids and realized kids really, you don't have passion or compassion for kids. But maybe it's working with people who are older folks, maybe folks that are dealing with ailments and folks that are going through difficult seasons of life. Maybe for you, you're passionate about business and leadership and starting companies and starting businesses, and you're an entrepreneur of sorts. Maybe it's about teaching people to lead selflessly. And maybe for you, a compassion project that really struck a chord with you was found back in session number 2. Maybe for you, it's working with people who are struggling with poverty, trying to make ends meet. Maybe the homeless people. Maybe someone who is caught in an addiction or struggling with mental illness or mental health issues. Maybe for you, it's dealing with the session number 4 that we talked about, helping people who are sick. Maybe for you, it's helping the next generation. It's getting involved in mentoring in a mentoring program. Maybe it's talking to your pastor, talking to other people in your small group, or getting together and how can we reach the next generation, the kids in our community, the kids in our city. How can we reach those that are in middle school and high school, maybe even elementary, if you will, or college age students that you find. And so we come back to each one of these questions, and it leads us then to what we'll find in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, and then as well, Romans chapter 12, verses 6 through 13. If you have not read those verses yet, go ahead and pause the video for a moment, have someone in your group read those verses, and then jump back in with me for the video outline discussion on page 95. As we look there on page 95, live out your compassion calling. What does that look like? As you look there, number 1 is this. We find when it comes to living out our compassion calling, we see number 1 is identify your compassion passion. Identify your compassion passion. There's the different passions that we've talked about, the different challenges, to different ways to show compassion. And so what makes you passionate? What lights you up? Romans chapter 12, verse 6, we find this. It says there, in His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing things well. So there's some things that we don't do well at all. And usually those things, well, most often it's a very rare person who does something and they do really poorly at it and they don't have the self-awareness to realize, well, I'm not really good at this. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes those situations unfold where somebody says, man, I love kids, but they really don't love kids. Or somebody who says, man, older people, they just love me, and older people really can't stand them. But what is it that you really find you're passionate about? We look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 says as well, it echoes that what Paul says, Peter says as well. God has given each of you a gift from His great variety of spiritual gifts. Use them well to what? Serve one another. Again, this is our compassion calling. So as you look in your notes there on page 95, really what it comes back to is what makes you tick. What really causes you to light up? If you can imagine with me for a moment, if you draw a picture there, just a real tiny picture in the white space there on page 95, draw a picture of a tree. Now what I want you to do is draw the roots of the tree, draw the trunk of the tree, draw the branches, and then draw the leaves all over the tree. So there's 4 different parts of the tree. There's the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. When it comes to what makes you tick and what ticks you off, what's interesting is a tree really illustrates those 4 different areas of our lives. We have the leaves, which is our actions, the choices we make, the things that we do in life. But the branches on those trees, well, those are the behaviors. Those are the things that we have habits, the things that we do. The trunk of the tree are our beliefs, what we believe. And what we find is the roots. Those are our values, our value system. And really what we find is what makes us tick and what ticks us off starts there in the roots of our life, the value system we have. And from there, we have from our values, we create and develop beliefs. What do we believe about life? What do we believe about ourselves? What do we believe about other people? What to believe about our past, our present, our future? What do we believe about God? What do we believe about our purpose? So you have our values are the roots, the trunk of the tree are our beliefs, and then the branches, they are, again, as I mentioned before, those are our behaviors, those are our habits, those are the things that we have our routines, and then the output are our actions, the fruit, if you will, or the leaves on the tree. So when it comes to showing your compassion, if you drive down, if you look at your actions, if you look at the fruit of your life, when you drill down from the fruit to your behavior, to your beliefs, to your value system, really once you get down to the value system, you'll see where God has gifted you. If you're reading through, as you read through the devotional, you're going to find out this week in the coming readings that many times what grieves us is how God gifts us. Those things that grieve our hearts, many times God uses our pain and our experiences as an opportunity for us to find our purpose in life. It's difficult because nobody wants to wake up and find that, well, I want to always be reminded of painful things in my life. But many times as you look throughout the scriptures and study the Bible, God allows people to go through some very difficult seasons of life. And from there, they find their purpose and their gifting, if you will, what they're compassionate about, they're passionate about. As we look, that leads us right to this next point, Lamentations 3:51, where Jeremiah writes these words. He says, "My eye is grieved, my heart is grieved when I see what's happened." Another translation in the King James says, "My eye affects my heart. What I see affects how I feel." We find then, how do we do something about it? A lot of times people complain about things in life. There's problems that I see and I don't like it, and we stop there. But let's go from complaining to having compassion. What can we do about what we see? Romans chapter 12, verses 6 through 8 talks about this. He says, if you preach, just preach God's message, nothing else. If you help, just help. Don't take over. If you teach, stick to your teaching. If you give encouraging guidance, be careful that you don't get bossy. If you're put in charge, don't manipulate. If you called to give aid to people in distress, keep your eyes open and be quick to respond. If you work with the disadvantaged, don't let yourself get irritated with them or depressed by them. Keep a smile on your face. We look then, the question for us then is this: when it comes to identifying your passion, do I have a passion to, number one, preach? Another way of put this would be, do I have a passion to talk about the truth, to tell people the truth? Whether it's literally preaching, or maybe it's giving counsel to someone, or sharing the gospel with somebody, then share Jesus with confident faith is what we find there. He says, number two, if our passion is to serve people, then care for those who are sick physically, mentally, and emotionally. To serve people who need help. Just help. Don't try to take over the situation. And then number three, the third bullet point there on the next page there, we see page 96, serve, and then teach. Teach the next generation. If you teach, stick to your teaching. Stay in your lane. The next point is this: encourage. Then inspire people physically, emotionally, and spiritually, taking care of all three parts. If you give encouraging guidance, be careful that you don't get bossy. Don't be domineering, trying to dominate somebody and try to tell them what to do, how to live. He says encourage them, inspire them. The next point, the next ability is giving. If you have the ability to give with generosity. Give to the poor with generosity. If you're called to give aid to people in distress, keep your eyes open and be quick to respond. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, we can rationalize ourselves and think our way out of compassion. What about leadership? If you've been called and gifted to lead, then serve as a selfless leader. He says there, if you're put in charge, don't manipulate. Don't try to force people against their will. Don't try to lord over other people. Then last of all, he says, be kind. If you work with disadvantage, don't let yourself get irritated with them or get depressed by them. Keep a smile on your face. Show compassion with gladness. Be kind. Another way to put it is this: if you have a gift for hospitality, for just loving on people, the gift for gift giving, do it with kindness and compassion. That leads us to our second point when it comes to understanding our compassion calling. Number two, then, from Romans 12 is this: love people deeply. Love people deeply. And so we identify our passion, But then number 2, we find love people deeply. Romans chapter 12, verse 9 says this: don't just pretend to love others. Don't just go through the motions. Don't be a pretender. He says, really love them. Hate what's wrong. Hold tightly to what's good. Love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring others, each other. In our society today, we don't honor, this whole concept is a little bit out of date and old fashioned of honoring each other. I honor, we don't say things like that. We don't say I honor you, or we don't even really say I respect you. If we do, we say that, well, it's because maybe we have to. But we don't use the term honor well. We don't give each other dignity. If anything, we try to take away honor, respect, and dignity from other people. We look there on the top of page 97. To love is revealed in the face of stress, conflict, and sacrifice. To truly love somebody, the true test of love is when we're in a stressful situation, when we're in the midst of a conflict or an argument, or when it costs us something, when it's a sacrifice. You see, there's that phrase that says, live at the speed of love. What does that exactly mean? Well, we unpack it a little bit here. How long does it take to show love to somebody? That's what it means to live at the speed of love. Live life at the pace that will allow you to be present mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually with people. Just like we talked with Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, living at the speed of love means that I'm not so busy with my schedule that I don't have the opportunity to take time for people. If my schedule is just jam-packed where I have no margin to slow down and help people, I'm going to live the rest of my life with never having taken the time to find rest in my soul and contentment in my life because I'm just rushing from one thing to the next. We're going to live lives that are exhausted, that are discouraged, that are stressed out and burned out. And eventually we're going to find ourselves being resentful and ungrateful and really unhappy. Why? Because we never live for something bigger than ourselves, and that is for God, and that is for living for other people. That truly is compassion at its best. Then we find number 3, how to live out our compassion calling. Work hard at developing your compassion passion. Work hard at developing that. How do we develop it? There's a couple different ways. Learn rhythms of rest and renewal. How to develop compassion? Learn rhythms of rest and renewal. Protect against burnout. In verse 11, we find there, Romans chapter 12, verse 11, it says, never be lazy, but work hard. And so there are going to be times in our lives where we're going to want to work hard and then take a break. Work hard and have a rhythm of work and rest, and enjoy life and go through those rhythms. If we're always working, if we're trying to prove our worth by how much we work, we're going to get burned out and really find ourselves in a life that's lonely and dissatisfied and resentful, really. And so we have seasons where we work really hard. We have seasons where we minister. We have seasons where we serve other people. But then we find ourselves that we take a break and take rest. If you feel that the times when you're not working, that it's sin, it probably means that work has become your idol or your God. If you find yourself that taking a break to you feels like you're being lazy, then you need to check your priorities and check your relationship with God if you're trying to find your worth from your work. Then we find the next idea is this: how to develop compassion. Do your best work when you're at your best. And usually that comes from a season of rest. Do your best work when you're at your best. He says there, work hard in the end of verse 11. But work hard. How do we do that? Well, do it when we're at our best. One of the challenges I know for many people is they work Monday through Friday. They just burn the candle at both ends. And when Saturday comes, well, there's family stuff to do. And then Sunday's really not a day of rest because there's more stuff to do. So when do we find rest? One of the challenges with showing compassion is sometimes we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the margin, we just don't have the opportunity to even care about other people because we're so busy. It may be time for us to take just a few moments to press pause on our schedule and to reevaluate where we're at with our life, reevaluate our work situation, reevaluate our family situation, reevaluate our commitments. And after we do some reevaluation, the question we need to ask ourselves, if I keep this up, where will this take me in 6 months? Where will I be in a year from now? Where will I be 5 years from now? Where will I be 10 years from now? And what will I be able to look back on? Will I have regrets or will I reminisce? What would I like the story to be in a year, 5 years, or 10 years from now? And is my schedule for my work, my family, my leisure time, and my commitments, will that lead me to a story that honors God, and loves people? And so my question for us is, what are you doing to show compassion? What are you doing to show compassion? What are your plan for your compassion project? We find not only do your best work when you're at your best, when you've got rest, serve with anticipation and expectation. Serve with anticipation and expectation. We see he says there, and serve the Lord enthusiastically, the end of verse 11. Serve the Lord enthusiastically. The word enthusiasm literally means to be God-filled or in God. Entheos, or enthusiasm, means to be inspired or filled with God. And so he says the goal is not to serve like half-heartedly or, oh, I'm here because I have to be here, but serve with the anticipation and expectation. Again, it's serving and ministering from a place of rest, to have those rhythms, and again, to check ourselves before God, to say, God, am I doing this because I'm trying to find my worth? Even in my ministry, even the ministry I'm doing, sometimes we can be motivated to do compassionate projects and compassionate things because we want to look good and because we want to have a name for ourselves. And yet the question is, why am I doing this? Am I working from a place and rhythm of rest? Then we find, as we serve with anticipation, anticipating and expecting God to do something great in and through our lives, the next point is this: how to develop compassion, patience, and more patience. He says there in verse 12, rejoice in our confident hope, be patient in times of trouble. Showing compassion, expressing compassion, it's messy. The word compassion, for all that we've talked about this whole 6 weeks, here's what compassion means: to suffer with somebody. The word passion, which is a part of it's a compound word, compassion, means suffer with somebody. The word passion, the passion of the Christ, passion means suffering. And so it's a Latin word, to suffer with someone, to get into their suffering with them, to be in the mess and the mixture with them. And sometimes, for many of us, we want to fix problems quickly. We don't like to be in negative situations. We don't like to feel uncomfortable. We don't like to feel in points or places of tension. And yet God calls us, compassion is simply being with somebody in their suffering. When you think about it, the greatest understanding of God's love for us, the greatest expression of God's love for us, how much he's passionate about you and me, is to understand what it means to suffer. That Jesus suffered for us. If you ever wanted to know what it is to show deep, deep love for somebody, it's to learn and to know what it is to suffer with somebody. Because then we know the degree to which God, his suffering was far greater than anything we could ever face this side of heaven, is far greater than anything we could ever face here on this life. And as difficult as suffering may be here on this earth, Jesus went far beyond that, exponentially beyond that in his suffering for us because he loved us. So when it comes to compassion, it takes a lot of patience. We're not in this for a sprint. We're in this for the long haul. This is a marathon, working and walking with people. And then fuel compassion with prayer and with praise. Fuel compassion with prayer and with praise. Pastor and author Craig Groeschel talks about this in his book called Winning the War in Your Mind, or Winning the Battle for Your Thoughts. He talks about this idea that many times we have thoughts that get the best of us. We talk to ourselves constantly. Experts say that 95% of the thoughts you thought yesterday, you'll think today. And 95% of those thoughts that you think today, you'll think tomorrow. So really, we think a lot of the same thoughts. We think literally thousands and thousands of thoughts every day. And that's why we find ourselves, if you've ever talked to a friend and they seem to talk about the same things, you know what they're talking about to themselves day after day after day. And so when they talk about whatever it is, that rut that they get stuck, that loop they can't get out of, that's really, they're just giving you an open invitation to see what's on their brain, what's on their mind all the time. And so for us, we've got that 5% that we can change. And Craig Groeschel talks about how prayer, the scientists have done studies and they found just 12 minutes of prayer a day for a period of 8 weeks. That's a 2-month period. If we pray and spend time in prayer, not too long. It's less than a half hour for what you would watch for a sitcom show. 12 minutes. That'll change and rewire our mind and give us greater capacity for empathy. praise as well. Praise is different than prayer. Prayer is really seeking God, requesting from God, and seeking his face. But praise is thanking God and gratitude toward God. He goes on to talk about in his book that the cingulate cortex, which is a part of our brain that handles the calming response, the soothing effect in our bodies, to self-soothe. For a child, one of the big challenges for parents early on with a newborn is how do you get your child to self-soothe when they're upset. And so you try to calm them down, you hold them tight, maybe you change their diaper, feed them a bottle, and try to rock them to sleep. But eventually, once a child can soothe themselves, and so we do things like having a pacifier, or we have maybe a baby carrier, that kind of a baby swing that kind of lulls them to sleep, or we play music, or whatever it is, all the different tricks of the trade, we're trying to get them to soothe. It's the cingulate cortex that, as we grow and to be an adult, that causes us to be able to calm ourselves down, to bring our heart rate down, to bring our blood pressure down, to bring our cortisol levels down. Because on the flip side, the other part of our brain that's right next to the cingulate cortex is the amygdala. And that is the place in our brain that has the fight, flight, or freeze response, if you will. So, hundreds of years ago, when our great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers were out hunting and gathering for food and foraging for food, if an animal was going to attack, that's where their amygdala would spring into action and it would grow in size and increase. Well, today, unless you're a hunter and living out in the wild somewhere and trying to live off the land, for us, threats would be your boss asking you about doing a project that maybe seems overwhelming. Threats to us would be, well, we're driving in traffic and we almost hit somebody, rear-end them in front of us. Threats might be the next family gathering when you have to face a family member that makes you kind of feel a little bit awkward. Threats might be having to deal with your child's school teacher. Threats might be a neighbor. Threats might be even your spouse. So we constantly, that fear of fight, flight, or freeze rears up. What happens, though, is when our amygdala increases, it causes our capacity for compassion to decrease. We become very less empathetic. And so what's amazing is this, is until we can find ourselves where the cingulate cortex increases and pushes back on the amygdala, until that happens, we're not going to be able to self-soothe just like a small child. What's the answer? How do we self-soothe? Praise. By praising God just for a few minutes can cause us to calm down, drop our heart rate, drop our blood pressure, drop those cortisol levels, the adrenaline rush that's in our system, and can calm us down. What's amazing is as we calm down, our capacity for compassion increases then as a result. And so the answer for us, we see here in Romans chapter 12, he says on page 98 to keep praying, keep praying. Number 4, then, as we wrap up this session, we see always be ready for hospitality. Always be ready for kindness, for hospitality. He says in verse 13, when God's people are in need, go ahead and underline that in your notes there. When people are in need, be ready to help them. Always be eager to practice what? Hospitality. Amanda and I, one of the passion projects that we worked on recently was a book called The Eshel Table. The word Eshel, as you see there in your notes, it's a Hebrew word that literally means hospitality. And the Hebrews, as they were writing their words in the Old Testament, it comes up multiple times where there is an Eshel tree, actually, that Abraham planted, and it was a place for people to come and sit under the shade when they were traveling through the wilderness. And so they would come and sit under the shade of a tree. So if you can imagine a hot, dry desert, if you found a tree to be able to sit under, it would give you shade. And so this tree was actually called a tamarisk tree, and it would actually work like air conditioning. And so what would take place is at night the tree would secrete salt from it, and it was also called not just a tamarisk tree, but a salt cedar was another term for this tree. And it would go ahead and secrete salt. Well, then during the daytime, as the salt secreted, the evaporation would take place, and it would cause the water that was drawn to that salt through the nighttime, it would cause that water to evaporate and actually cause a cooling effect. If you've ever heard of swamp coolers, we had one when we were in college at the church that we worked at in Mojave Desert. They had coolers called swamp coolers instead of air conditioners. It was the same effect. It was this evaporating effect that would cause for a cooling condition to take place. And so trees, these eshel trees or tamarisk trees, salt cedars, would be a place where you could find yourself getting cooled off by the day. It's natural, God's natural air conditioning. As you look at your notes, you see that the word Eshel, also spelled Aishel, is also its acronym or anagram, if you will, for what hospitality was to the Hebrews. Aleph, or the A of Eshel, means food. Shem means drink, and Lamed means comfort, accompaniment, or protection, or lodging. And so, as a reminder to people, when they would provide Eshel for someone, they would give them something to eat, something to drink, and a place to stay. That's what hospitality is. That's what compassion is. When we interact with people and show them hospitality, it's interesting. The word hospitality is similar to where we have our word hospital from. Hospitality and hotel, hospitality and a hostel, or a place for people to go ahead and stay. They are very similar to the word host, but it's also interesting that it's very similar to the word hostility or hostile, in that of being at odds with somebody. As you look there, we can leverage the power of gathering around a table with people to show compassion to them. As you see there, if you tracked through the devotional and even some of these sessions, you've probably heard this phrase at some point or another, whether through this study or somewhere else in life. You've heard this statement: people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And as we come to the end of this session, I would encourage you, as you wrap this up, go through the discussion questions, do the response section, but most importantly, as you come to the end of this, I would encourage you to read through the Compassion Project portion and go ahead and decide what you're going to do. Pick out the Compassion Project, put it on your calendar, schedule it out, and then go ahead and spend some time showing people compassion, whether it's through sharing Jesus, whether it's through a leadership development, or through caring for people who are in poverty, or caring for people who are sick, or teaching and reaching the next generation. Whatever that might look like, whatever works best for your group, plan that out, and then have a celebration time where you share the stories together of what you experienced, and you talk about it, and kind of have an opportunity to celebrate the compassion and what God has done in and through your group, and through your lives, and through your church. And then I would encourage you at the end of this session as well to take some time to pray and commit this to God. Thanks so much for tracking with us through this 40 days of compassion. My prayer for you is that as you show compassion to other people, that not only do you see lives around you changed, but you see your own life change as well. Because compassion, it's not showing kindness someday, it's showing compassion today. Thanks so much for watching.